Hello, I'm Matt Carpenter, and this is the Good Life Podcast. Hello, we are back with the Good Life Podcast, and I am pleased today to have Michael Sacasas with us. Mr. Sacasas is the Associate Director for Educational Programming at the Christian Studies Center in Gainesville, Florida, and he's also Associate Fellow in Ethics and Culture at the Greystone Theological Institute. For years, he had a blog called The Frailest Thing, which I'm sure hopefully he will talk about, the reason behind that name in a little bit. Mm-hmm. And now he has a Substack newsletter that I highly recommend called the Convivial Society. Now, I had the privilege of meeting Michael a few years back when we were in Lewiston, Idaho, and I was a pastor out there, and he came and spoke he was speaking at another church in the area, but he kindly agreed to speak also for a parenting group at our church. So, and that was a lot of fun. We all learned a lot. So anyway, Michael, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. Yeah, so glad to chat.
So just start out by talking about just your background, your relationship to the faith. What's kind of your story from beginning to where you are now?
Sure. Yeah, I came to faith in my youth in the context of a Baptist church where I grew up. I grew up in Miami, Florida. That faith matured over the years, and I attended a small liberal arts Christian college that is now actually defunct, Clearwater Christian College. It was in that period where I began gravitating towards Reformed theology and ended up moving into the Presbyterian tradition. After undergrad, I did an MA in theological studies at Reformed Theological Seminary in Orlando. I was there from 1999 to 2002. It was actually there that I first began to think about the relationship that technology might have to how we live our lives and the kinds of communities that we're a part of. That actually became kind of a major project in my own work and writing and thinking over the years, and have remained in the Presbyterian tradition since then. Have been glad to play a role in Christian schools. I was an adjunct for a while at Belhaven College, where there was actually an extension in Orlando, the main campus over in Jackson, Mississippi, as you may know. And a fellow at the Greystone Theological Institute that I is founded and run by my lifelong friend Mark Garcia. So lots of different contexts in which I've had the opportunity to think and reflect about what it means to think Christianly about the moral life, about the choices we make with our tools, about the shape technology gives to our society, and have had the pleasure of continuing that work here at the Study Center, the Christian Study Center in Gainesville, where that's in essence kind of what we do: try to bring the best of the intellectual tradition to bear on our thinking about society, our thinking about what the shape our culture takes, and what it means to live faithfully in that context.
So your work at the Christian Studies Center, is that something do you work directly with the college students at UF, or is that distinct from it? What is the relationship and kind of the impetus behind that?
Right. So we're not affiliated with the university directly. So there's a loose network of 30 to 40, maybe a few more study centers. They don't all have study center in their name. They may be called something like Anselm House, which is at the University of Minnesota, or Chesterton House at Cornell. But they all have a kind of a similar DNA, which is that they the way I would say is that they're rather than being parachurch ministries in the sense that we might think of Crew or InterVarsity or Young Life or something of that sort, or RUF. We think of ourselves as a para-university institution. In other words, our focus is on the life of the mind. This will range a little bit depending on the study center. Some will have a little bit more programming that feels more like campus ministry in terms of being sort of designed around fellowship. But here, certainly, we have reading groups. We have a class for undergraduate and graduate students. We host lectures from whether it's our staff or guest scholars from the university or from that we bring from other locations. And so we try to cultivate a space for thoughtful reflection, for meaningful conversation, and again, to kind of represent the intellectual tradition here in the context of the university community as best we can. So we do work directly with students that come our way. We also try to build good relationships with faculty, whether they're Christian or non-Christian faculty at the university. And we also see the local clergy, local campus ministers as another contingent that we try to work with and serve in various capacities throughout the school year. Yeah.
Okay. So before we go too far into this discussion, we need to probably define some terms for people, because most people, when you say the word technology, people generally know what that's talking about. But it actually helps, I think, to have some tangible handles, that we can use when we're having this discussion. So, how do you define, in short form, the word technology?
That's a wonderful question and a great question to start with. And in fact, whenever I'm doing what I think of as a sort of technology 101 class, or talk or whatever, that's what I start with. What is technology? And it's a good question to start with, but it's also an almost impossible question to answer succinctly.
Certainly.
Yeah. So. One thing to note about the word, so rather than answering your question directly, I'm going to talk about it.
Great.
One thing to note about even the word technology is that it's relatively recent. It's a relatively recent addition to the English language in the way that we use it, right? And by relatively recent, I would say that it's probably not until the early to mid 20th century that the word technology gets used as the kind of catch-all term that we tend to use in the way that we tend to use it, right? And by catch-all, what I mean by that is if I were sitting in a room with you or giving a talk somewhere, I would ask people to look around the room and say, ask them, where is the technology in this room? And pretty soon, if I look around my room, right where I'm at right now, my office, right, I have a whiteboard in front of me. That's technology. There are markers there. There's a phone. I have a computer that I'm using right now. I have earphones. I have a calendar. I have a pencil in my hand. All of these are forms of technology, right? Defined broadly. I think the temptation, I think, often is to think of technology as relatively new gadgets, right? So my smartphone maybe, or my smart speaker if I have, Alexa or something in my home, or maybe not a car, but an electric car or an autonomous vehicle. Maybe we think of it as technology. But in fact, it all is, right? This is all technology, right down to writing itself, right? The forms of inscription that we use to put words into writing, that's a technology. So it's this expansive category. It includes, from the mundane pencil in my hand to the satellites that make what we're doing right now possible. And it captures all of these things together in such a way that in some respects it becomes a kind of useless term when you're trying to have a critical and thoughtful discussion about it. So for instance, it's not uncommon to hear people ask or claim that someone is anti-technology. And in some respects, it's almost a nonsensical claim, right? Because it's impossible to be anti-technology in principle, right? Because what we use to make our food, the shelter we provide for ourselves, the clothing, right? All of this fits in that category. And I think you'd be very, very hard pressed to find anybody who is consistently anti-technology, right? So the word sometimes gets in the way of attempting to think about these realities that we're trying to understand. So I sometimes use the phrase, the human-built world, right, or our human-built milieu, and um, by that I try to suggest that our material culture maybe is another way of talking about it. But again, up until mid to early 20th century, uh, technology didn't serve this function in our language. In fact, it meant what we tend to associate with words that end in ology, right? So biology, the study of life; theology, the study of God; geology, the study of rocks, right, of the earth. And technology was mid 19th century, for example, is just the study of techne, of how you make things. And this is, for example, the way it's intended in the name of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Right, at MIT was where you went to learn how to make things. It wasn't a designation for the things you made, but for the study of making. Right, and stemming from that Greek word techne, which is sometimes translated art or craft. So when I talk about technology, I'm in a sense mean to include all of these things, but then I very quickly want to move us to specific cases. Although there are, I think, patterns within the wider, techno-social milieu that we can begin to identify. But I think it's often important to ask about particular technologies and sort of avoid, as far as possible, making broad generalizations about whether technology is bad or good. Those claims, I think, don't get us very far. So that's not quite a direct answer, but I think I'd say anything that you can point out and say that wouldn't be here if humans didn't exist. In some respects, can be, justly categorized as what we think of as technology.
Okay, so even excuse me, some of what the Bible calls wisdom, particularly the men who were craftsmen
Hmm.
who were able to help build the tabernacle. It said that God had given them the spirit of wisdom. So
Hmm.
that from what I hear you saying could be considered uh, technology in the sense that we're talking about.
Right. So here's another helpful way. And yes, so short answer, yes, right. So the craftsmen working, whether with fabrics to make the curtains of the tabernacle, or working in bronze to create the implements that were part of worship. These are they are creating. They're technologists, right? They're creating technology. Um, One other thing that I do, instead of giving a definition of technology, right, which is not impossible. I don't know, how useful it is, but is to distinguish between certain levels of what we might think of as the technological dimensions of life, right? So at the foundational concrete level, you have artifacts, devices, tools, right? Things that you can, in a sense, hold in hand, or very concretely point to, right? And say, well, this thing here, this is a tool, a device, an artifact, a technology. And that's pretty easy, to wrap our heads around. But if you go a level up of abstraction above that, we might think of technological systems, right? So, one older example that works to illustrate this is that, the railway car, right, or the railroad. You could imagine standing in front of a railroad engine car and saying that's a technology, right? It's a fairly advanced industrial age technology, but it doesn't run on its own, right? You need to build a network of railways, right, in order to make this function, and it also depends on the mining of coal for its operation, and so there's this whole system that starts to build around the discrete artifact in order to help that artifact work, right? A more contemporary example is we can think of the communication networks that make possible what we're doing right now, right? So the computer, the broadband networks, the satellites, the code that generates the images on our screen. All of that is a hugely complex system that makes the discrete parts work the way we want them to work. And but that system also interestingly has not only kind of material components, but it often ends up having social components as well, right? So one thing that the railroads ended up necessitating were synchronized or standardized time, right? So the time zones were a way of sort of helping synchronize the movement of railroads across their tracks in order to avoid accidents, right? So you then get these social outcomes that are tied to helping create, a technology that's going to work efficiently and safely. And so the system ends up incorporating more than just the tool and all the parts of the system to make that tool work. Likewise with the automobile, this is a common example, but what we think of as suburbia, right? Suburbia is a geographic and social outcome of the invention of the automobile, right? And so it has, that has had social consequences, the consequences of the family for work life, political consequences in terms of creating a different kind of constituency from that, which is centered in urban centers and rural centers. So that systemic level, right? That level where the tool depends on a system and then generates systemic effects. And then, even a level beyond that, we might also talk about technique, right? So I'm borrowing this word from Jacques Ellul, and we can talk more about him later. But he's a brilliant French polymath of the 20th century, a lay theologian in his own right, and wrote extensively about technology. And he used technique to include technologies as we think of it, but also a kind of disposition that today I think we would say something like it's the imperative to optimize, right? To always look for the most efficient way of doing something, right? And that becomes, I think of that as in this continuum of the technological, right? From the material to the system to a way of thinking, right? To a way of approaching problems. One this I realize is a little abstract, but one way of thinking about this that I think kind of drives the point home is that there are an increasing number of scholars and practitioners that are beginning to approach death not as a feature of the human condition, right, with moral and existential dimensions, but as they might put it, as an engineering problem, right?
Yes.
And so if we can approach the sources of human frailty, of aging in the body as an engineering problem, then perhaps it's a problem that can be solved, right? So death is no longer, or even aging, say, is no longer a matter of human wisdom, of spiritual insight, of moral formation. It doesn't live in those categories anymore. Now it lives in the categories of a technical problem for which we want a technical solution, right? And so it changes the meaning of that experience for the human being when you approach it as an engineering problem or a technical problem that is susceptible to a technological solution. And so there's that more abstract way of bringing technology, a technological way of thinking, or a way of thinking that turns towards the technological to areas of life that we would not ordinarily have thought about in those terms historically or traditionally.
And it's not a question that we can avoid. Everyone has some type of view of technology, and everyone has limits that they put on how much they want to allow technology in. So oftentimes it can seem like there's a sharp distinction between people who are for technology and those who are against technology. Mm-hmm. So all the knuckle draggers out there who just still refuse to buy a smartphone or fill in the blank, whatever it is. Right. But everyone draws the line at some point, even if no parent says to their 3-year-old, "Here, I'm going to let you drive this car."
Right.
So that's a lie.
Right. Yeah.
And I think probably at least every Christian would say, if we had the power to make every person around us do exactly what we wanted, that is not a technological power we should have. That is
Right.
intrinsically wrong. So if
One
with
would hope.
that,
Yeah. Right.
sure, certainly, but with those two examples, everyone will draw that line. I say everyone again. We hope every Christian
Mhm.
at least would draw those lines. So it's not that It's not that you have some people with lines and others who don't. It's a matter of where do you draw them.
Right. Right. And how open are you to sort of adapting, kind of letting the chips fall where they will, and cleaning up the messes after the fact, right? And that has an interesting history, and I think in Western culture, maybe specifically in American culture, historically, we banked a lot on technology. I would kind of make the argument that what we sort of associate with the Enlightenment optimism about progress was understood very broadly as moral progress, intellectual progress, political progress. But during the 19th century, it gets very narrowly defined as technological progress. And so as long as we see technological progress, we then can sort of assume that our society is advancing and maturing and heading in the right direction. And so wherever we have had periods where it seems as if technology is stagnating, and there are some people who would make that argument even of our present moment, there's a kind of anxiety because we've tied the health of our society to the ability to make measurable and significant technological progress. And so we've invested a lot in it. And I think also it's the case that mostly, I think, people have thought about technology. Well, I should say, I think many people haven't thought about technology historically, right? They haven't. It hasn't been something that they've necessarily needed to think about very critically. There are exceptions to that, but I would say around the early 19th century, you begin to see, I think, more and more critical reflection about what we think of as technology. Although at the time they may have been calling it, like the mechanical arts or invention or something like that. And the reason for that is that this is a kind of contested point, right? But my case would be that there is an acceleration of technological change, so that society receives these kind of shocks that it isn't able to absorb in the same way that historically, for example, a society may have been able to sort of absorb the introduction of the water mill, which may have over time kind of changed the dimensions of labor to some degree, or the way a city was organized to some degree. But you begin to get rapid and significant technological change in a way that I think forces the question, right? The world around me is changing. The way I relate to others is changing. And then you begin to get more critical reflection on this thing, right? Our tools, what we've made. And I think that I think in a period now where that's become even more heightened. I think in the last probably 7 years or so, maybe 5-7 years, you've seen some more critical voices question, and this is sort of across the political social spectrum, question the role that technology has in our lives. But before that, I would say that sort of the default is to think of technology as a neutral tool. Technology is neutral. What matters is what we do with it. And so yeah, just you invent, adopt, and ask questions later, if at all. And again, I think that may be changing to some degree, but that's been generally the pattern in American society historically, with few notable exceptions, like the Amish, for example.
Right. They're often the ones that people, when you're in a conversation, the person who doesn't the person who says, actually, I don't think we need I think I need an Instagram or account or TikTok, and the person says, "What, are you want to be Amish? What's the
Right.
problem?" There's
Right.
not much in between.
Right.
Now,
Or
go ahead.
no, I was gonna say, or worse, a Luddite. When you really
Oh
want to
yes,
slur them, yeah, it's a Luddite, right? Yeah.
yeah, right, yes. So actually, I know you already know this, but Kirkpatrick Sale has a really helpful book on the history of the Luddites
Hmm.
that I've looked at, and it's not in. I mean, now Sale is very much on their side, and I have to say, I mean, he does present a case for them that I've never heard presented by anyone in the
Hmm.
past.
Hmm.
So, it's helpful at least to just get the opinion of the losing side in
Hmm. Right. Right.
in that discussion.
Right. And that they weren't just they just weren't anti-technology, right?
Right,
There's a way of life that they're trying to defend, their livelihood. They're very selective in the way that they protested through the breaking certain machines, um, and that it had dimensions of what today we would sort of classify as a kind of labor rights, right? So it's a much more complicated picture, to say the least, right, than the way
right,
that it's usually framed as sort of backwards reactionaries who are just breaking technologies because they don't like them.
right, right.
Yeah, yeah.
So, one of the things I hope what we can consider is that a few of the people who have influenced you. I know in reading your newsletter and your blog before that, we can't get to everyone as much as I would like that.
Mm-hmm.
But now, correct me if I'm wrong. You wrote your master's thesis though on Hannah Arendt. Is that true? Or
Well,
is it,
it was going to be the case. So I was in a PhD program, which I left ABD, or all but dissertation. I was beginning to write my dissertation, and the dissertation was going to center around the work of Hannah Arendt.
okay,
So that's where that comes in, and she's remained a very important voice in my own thinking. And in fact, we just wrapped up. We did a reading group this semester here at the study center with Hannah Arendt as our focus. So yes, she's been very important for me.
well, a lot of people in the circles where I've read in the last several years, they talk about her as the prophetic voice of totalitarianism. With her book on totalitarianism, and then
Hmm.
her book, The Banality of Evil. But you refer often to her book, The Human Condition,
Hmm.
as a unique contribution to the discussion, of technology and what is the role of technique in society. So, what is her contribution to this discussion?
That is a good question. I'm going to try to give a good answer to it. So I think part of what I wanted to argue in the dissertation was that there is an implicit philosophy of technology in her work. So she never writes a book about technology per se. The Human Condition is not a book about technology in the conventional sense. Um, but she is thinking about technology in a lot of her work. And for example, in the preface to The Human Condition, which I think is sort of worth the price of admission on its own, and your readers can, I think, pretty easily find the PDF of that preface online. But she says the impetus for thinking about this book, for thinking about the theme of this book, were two things. And she's writing in the mid 1950s. The first was Sputnik, right? So the launch, so late 1950s. So the launch of Sputnik is one thing that kind of spurs her to think about the human condition. And specifically, what she means by the human condition, she is going to, in that book, think about action, right? So I'll give a little background, then kind of answer that question more directly. if your listeners may be familiar with the division between the active life or the vita activa and the contemplative life, or the life of the mind, and in the human condition, she is focusing on the life of action, the life of doing, and so she divides that actually into three categories, and this is, I think, part of my affinity for Arendt is that she makes a lot of good distinctions, and she won't tell you what to think, but I think she helps us think through things. And in making these distinctions, for example, of the active life, she distinguishes between labor, which she connects to biological life, right? Just labor is what the human being needs to do in order to survive in the world, right? To produce food or secure food, shelter. This is the realm of labor tied to biological life, and often was connected to the household historically. Then from labor to work. By work, she means very specifically the work of building a common world and creating the layer of human culture that outlives any one person, right? So we're born into a world that is a result of work, not the earth, but a world that's a result of work, a human world, and that human world will outlive us. And so work is the contribution to this sort of stable element of the human life world. And then action. So labor, work, action, and action is political, right? And for her, that she's just, some would say overly enamored of the Greek polis and the ideals of the Greek democratic, ancient Greek democratic ideals. But the life of action, the political life, the life where we stand before our fellows and move them with our words, or sway the way that our community is going to live. That was the highest form of human action, of human doing, right? And so, in working on this and being drawn to think about that, she says Sputnik does this, right, because it suggests a totally different relationship to our life world, that we're now able to place a human-made satellite in orbit, and all that kind of comes with that. The other thing is automation. So we have a lot of talk today about automation, its relationship to employment, whether it's going to displace workers, to such a degree that we need to resort to universal basic income. So this is part of our own kind of rhetorical context. The first wave of that kind of discourse happens in the 1950s. And so she is looking at these early signs of the role that automation may play in leaving people without means of work or income. And so she's spurred to think about what it means to be human in a sense, and what it means to be active in the world because of these technological developments. So she also has this, and she's not a Christian. She's Jewish, but she's not religiously Jewish, right? She's agnostic, I think, is probably the best way of describing it, if not just an outright atheist. But she's very conversant with not only the Jewish theological tradition, but the Christian theological tradition. She wrote her dissertation on St. Augustine and love in the work of St. Augustine. And she has this way of speaking about the human condition as given, as a gift, and she refers to it as a gift from nowhere, secularly speaking. And so that approach to thinking about the human being being properly at home in the earth, in a body, and living within certain limits is a very helpful. I think even Christians sometimes do a very good job of thinking in those terms, right? Where we're tempted by the Promethean vision of technology that makes us do, promises to allow us to do whatever we want on our terms, and puts us in a relationship of mastery to the world, or over the world, and even to other human beings. But I think Arendt encourages us to think more critically about what it means that the earth is properly our home, that that there's a human scale to the shape of our communities that is appropriate and good, and beyond that, numerous distinctions that she makes. For example, in that book between the private, the public, and what she calls the social, this realm that opens up because of mass society in the 20th century. So it would be hard for me to encapsulate, what is the one insight that Arendt gives us. I think it's just that she is thinking through many of these questions in a way that is very fruitful for me, right? That I have found very useful in reapplying certain categories or thinking through current developments through some of the terminology that she provides me with and some of the again, categories and arguments that she makes. So I'm not sure how satisfying an answer that is, but
Oh no,
she's great. Yeah,
it is a helpful answer. She's always intrigued me. I've
yeah,
not given a lot of attention to her writing, but
hmm,
her philosophical background with Heidegger and
hmm,
Karl Jaspers
hmm, hmm,
just it's just interesting. It was an interesting time philosophically in Europe
hmm,
and
hmm,
the United States then. But that
yeah,
leads me kind of to my next question, which is, considering that period in the post-war United States, Britain, and on the continent of Europe, you had you had several men and women who were questioning where we are headed now. So,
hmm,
Alan Jacobs wrote a book,
hmm.
I think about, I don't know, the title's 1945, the year of our Lord 1945 or something like
Hmm.
that.
1941, I think, or
Oh,
42.
41. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Here, I turn around on my shelf.
I've
Make
got it on
sure.
my shelf inside.
40,
So as you can,
43, 43.
okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. I
I'm,
just
I'm, I'm
looked at it. Yeah.
good. I'm glad
Yeah.
you did. So one of
Yeah.
those early 1940 years, but
Hmm.
he talks about thinkers like
Hmm.
C.S. Lewis, which I don't know
Hmm.
if I can make it through one podcast without bringing Lewis up at some point.
Yeah.
So C.S. Lewis, Auden, T.S. Eliot,
Right.
Simone Weil,
Yep.
and others. So what was it though that precipitated this unique conflagration of people who are all thinking and in their own way, they're not just thinking, but they're warning, we need to be careful about where this is going.
Yeah.
So what precipitates this? What gave rise to this?
Right. Well, I mean, in that time period, right, the rise of totalitarianism and specifically the threat that Nazism posed to European. Well, in some respects, it's hard to disassociate it from European civilization, but it is also this threat to European civilization, um, and I think it's hard for us to put ourselves um, in their shoes and to see the threat of even a kind of global cataclysm that becomes more pronounced with the dropping of the atomic bombs at the end of the war, but that's the direction towards which we were trending, right? And and I think if you go back, so these were all of these were people who came of age um, around the time of World War One or in its immediate aftermath, right? And we're still grappling with the application of industrialization to human warfare and its unprecedented consequences and the kind of suffering at scale that and destruction at scale that it had caused and how that's in many respects consummated in the conventional dimensions of the Second World War, and that there's a spirit in this, and I think, um, it's funny. Alan just had an article that came out in the latest issue of the New Atlantis, which is a journal I'd certainly highly recommend to your audience. And in it, he's I think the title is something like "Why Are We All Going Nuts?" And he encourages us to reflect on demonology,
Yes.
or what we might think of as the principalities and powers. I think Jacques Ellul does a little bit of this at some point, but that
In the new demons.
there's a spirit. That's right, a spirit in the air that they judge to be just inhumane. and that part of this is tied up with what Lewis captures so well in in prose form, or in a more didactic form, right, in the Abolition of Man, but then gets incorporated into a narrative in That Hideous Strength, right? That there is this threat that by our ability in this quest to master nature, we are ultimately going to render the human being obsolete, or we're going to risk annihilating, right, the human being as we know it, as we've known it. And of course, Lewis was very perceptive about this, because he understood that, as he puts it, right, the power of men over nature really turns out to be the power of some men over others, right? And so there's I think a palpable existential threat, right, that they sense, moral, ethical. In the case of these five thinkers, it has religious dimensions, but it's driven in part by what we are now able to do, and this technocratic spirit that has driven so much of this development of our destructive capacities. And that even apart from the very evident deployment of weaponry with mass destructive capacities, but there's a way of thinking about life that we might think of as deeply bureaucratic, right, coldly technological, that was itself a kind of threat to what they valued and what they held dear, and the I almost want to suggest, maybe this is a good time to mention the title of my old blog, right? The frailty of the human condition, but that in an effort to overcome that frailty, we would end up, worse off than where we were to begin with in some respects. But anyway, that's shooting off in a lot of different directions. But I think that's what they're responding to, and perceptively so.
Yes. Yeah, that war, and I know we can talk about atrocities in any war, but because I taught American history and world history for 15 years, and I've always had a catch internally when I consider, of course, the atomic bomb question has been debated quite a bit, and a reasonable debate, certainly. But just one that is not debated, sadly, is the Allied firebombing of Dresden,
right.
which killed many thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, and Tokyo. So the Allies, the good side, as is in our history books, we have technology now to kill vast amounts of citizens, and it's not our soldiers doing it. So it's not with sword and bullet where you see every victim that you are killing. Now it is you're flying a plane at the order of a commander, and you drop a bomb, and it just decimates and burns thousands of people alive. Right. I mean, and there's no. You can't say that is not tied, that those decisions are not tied to our newfound ability to use weapons like that.
Right. Absolutely, and I think you're right. I don't think we, the we is very generic here. Many people do think very critically about this, right? But too often, I think it's we gloss over this, right? The amount of destruction that was caused, and these thinkers that Jacobs highlights, they knew that was, they thought critically about that. They had reservations. I think, Jacobs, if I remember correctly, highlights the kind of reservations that Lewis expressed, and that he was criticized for expressing, about the way that the Allies were conducting the war. but right, it was unprecedented in scale, and I think you're right. Obviously, human beings have done horrible things to one another for since time immemorial. But the scale at which this is happening, and the moral valence of it, and that there's a trajectory here, right? From what you're describing, the machine gun before it, right, to kill indiscriminately at great distances in World War One, to firebomb in World War II, to what we think of now as smart weapons, or back in the Gulf War, for example, where we have these grainy black and white videos of the smart bomb narrowing on focusing on its target and landing, and it's being launched from Kansas, or directed from Kansas or whatever, and then the application, the possibility, almost certain use of autonomous weapons in modern warfare, and that there will be reasons offered for why it's necessary to use such weapons, but the moral dimensions, the consequences, we need to grapple with them far more than I think many of us do.
As a liberal society, and by liberal, I mean one who values freedom above almost anything else. It's always been difficult for us, being essentially the big guy on the continent, ever since we were, even when we were the 13 colonies that after we became the United States, we have been relatively free from any foreign attack. And so our drive for freedom, along with increased technology, has rendered us largely unable to think about how the greater freedom of one always ends up being the less for someone else.
Yeah, right.
And so I don't even know the answer. It's kind of a chicken and egg question, but does greater technological capacity give rise to a more and more liberal state, or is it the liberal state that unleashes the push for greater technology? And I don't have an answer to that. So, how about you?
Yeah, I don't know. I'd say I have an answer. I think they're deeply intertwined, right? So, speaking in kind of very broad generalities, there's a entanglement of what we would think of as the technoscientific dimensions of Western modernity, with its political ambitions and its economic markets, right? These are all entangled in ways that does make it hard to separate them and say, this is a technological development, this is an economic one, this is a political one. But the ideology of freedom, if you like, right, that privileges a specific form of freedom, right, that is, it's freedom from constraint, or negative liberty, and that resists limits. Let us put it that way, is empowered by the technology. So Lewis in The Abolition Man is a beautiful paragraph where he talks about how it was the characteristic of ancient wisdom to realize or understand or believe that our desires needed to be conformed to an order that was external to us, and that in the modern world we've inverted that so that we try to bend the order of the world to fit our desires. And what has made that plausible, right? The only way that we could even think that as human beings, right? Because when Lewis says, the ancient wisdom, the traditional wisdom of old, he doesn't just mean Christian wisdom. It's just the default wisdom of human moral traditions, religious traditions, philosophical traditions, that there is an order beyond the human, and that the human soul needs to bend itself to fit that order, right? Now, how you conceive of that order varies across all those traditions. But the fact that we can even begin to think differently is only plausible because of the power that modern science and technology grants the human being. And then all of a sudden you can begin to think about bending the world to fit our desires, right? And you can do that, broadly at the level of humanity against nature, but that feeds right into sort of consumer society, where our tools are at our beck and call for us to bend the world to our desires as much as we are able to, and so that and political liberalism, to the degree that it brackets substantive questions, that it refuses to sort of answer the question of substantive goods. It makes it extremely difficult then to reflect morally about the implementation of technology in the way, say, that the Amish do, right? Because you simply, well, one, you don't really immediately think about technology as something to think about morally, right? You just develop it, and you think of it as a good, almost an unalloyed good. And then ultimately, when you're asking questions about technology, it's eventually a question about the human good, right? What is human flourishing, and what is the human being? And so there's, if the liberal political order sort of brackets that question, then it is not equipped to question technology critically and to bring it under political control, human political control. So you get a co-development, right, of that impulse to master, to control, to bend the world to our will, of individualism, the power of the individual, abetted by technology, and then in political spaces that are incapable of bringing moral reflection and deliberate political reflection to bear on the question of technology, and all of that evolves sort of together. Yeah, that would be the way I would kind of frame the relationship.
And that bracketing of the anthropological question about what is man, what is good, and such, that's been for a long time. That bracket has been handed over to the private sphere, what we say. Well, this is a religious question, and as a liberal society, right, we don't answer religious questions because we're publicly right, neutral. Right. But now we see we're actually not publicly neutral, because whenever someone decides to speak to that, whenever someone presents a view that is in contrast to the spirit of the age, or Rousseau's general will, crushes them. Mm-hmm. It's not pretty.
Right. No, there's the neutrality, is aspirational at best, right? And then it was always, communitarian critics of liberal democracy have, I think, written well about this over the years, that there's neutrality always veiled existing moral commitments that were just unacknowledged in some respects, right? Or it didn't create a level playing field. Certainly not for substantive moral claims, right? So, and then how you're, we are questioning technology, is something that I think we've done publicly a little bit more of late. But for a long time, it was simply to get labeled a Luddite, right? To be, kind of laughed off as reactionary. And I mean, this is within, even the brief span of time that I've been writing about these questions. I'm, as the joke goes, right? I'm old enough to remember when social media was going to usher in a golden age of democracy across the globe.
Yes, greater participation and more greater liberalism for all.
Right, and a voice for everyone, and and the Arab Spring was kind of one kind of supposed to be a kind of case in point of this. And now the consensus, has flipped in such a way that, social media threatens to destroy democracy. There's a long article in the Atlantic, it just came out, I haven't read it yet, called After Babel, in which Jonathan Haidt seemingly frames social media as, this Babel-like confusion of the tongues with permanent consequences. Again, I can't speak to the merits of the article, right? But we've come a long way from when Twitter was going to spread democracy far and wide.
Well, and with the help, certainly, of the United States government and I mean even the financial support that's given, which this is, I don't want to go too far down this trail, but I mean our leaders have a vested interest in spreading certain supposed goods to the world,
Right.
because the more we, I mean, it's another way of spreading our way of life,
Right.
whether someone wants it or not.
Yes, right, right. Ivan Illich has a wonderful line about how we might convince ourselves to bomb our neighbors for their own good, and so that's a lot of truth to that, right? We're self-servingly, creating markets for our products, our goods, trying to sustain a global economic order that works, in our favor at the expense of others. So yes, and obviously there's a lot going on there. No.
And I know Illich is a favorite of yours, and I wish we had a lot more time to talk about him. His rules, or excuse me, his book, the Rules of Conviviality, or Tools of Conviviality.
Tools for Conviviality. Yeah.
Okay, Tools, and which is where I'm guessing the title of your Substack comes from.
Right. Yeah.
So what? And feel free to use Illich here as well as it's time to start winding down. I know, but the emphasis of this podcast is helping people think about what a good life is and how to pursue it.
Mm-hmm.
So, considering Illich and any other thinkers that you would bring in, how would you, what can we learn? What is it that we can take from these, from these thinkers? Because right now, I mean, frankly, we're drowning in information. We have information not just at our fingertips. I mean, it's already past our fingertips. So how do we carve out space to live well in the midst of this sea in which we're swimming?
Oh man, yeah, so much here, right? So, Derek Thompson, a writer for the Atlantic, recently again wrote about the growing amount of mental illness, right, or mental health problems in the younger generation, and what I think we now call Gen Z, and he goes through and kind of does a sociological analysis of this. It's good data. It's not just a function of greater awareness, so that more people know what it is, so you have more diagnoses. And he explores a variety of possible factors, and he ends up suggesting, the way I would put it is that maybe the constant 24/7 awareness of everything that's broken all the time has something to do with it, right? And I think there's certainly something to that. And part of me wants to say is, well, it's not just the awareness, right? If things are really broken, right, around you, right, if your society is not functioning well, right, if it's not conducive to human flourishing, then it's not just that you're aware of it, but the awareness itself heightens, perhaps, especially to the degree that you're not just aware of your own struggles, but you're aware of what is going on globally at any given moment. And I want to be careful, because I don't want to say, for instance, that we should turn a blind eye, for example, to what is happening in Ukraine, right? And that the answer is simply to just live in a little cave of our own making. But it does raise this question. When 1990s, I remember, the promise of the information superhighway. The idea that we're going to have the world at our fingertips. And as with so many technological promises, right, they have a Faustian character to them, right? We were never quite told what the cost was going to be, or that there even might have been a cost, right?
Right.
Thinking of that in terms of just even the structure, right, of the temptation in the garden, right? You're offered this, but what's being concealed from you, right? It's a half truth. You're dealing in half truths, and there's always something concealed. So, yes, I would say one way of addressing this is sort of reimagining limits as the conditions of our flourishing rather than as the obstacles that we need to overcome in order to flourish. All right. So Illich is very good on this. Wendell Berry, who had an affinity for Illich's work, your listeners may be very familiar with Wendell Berry's work, I think has also been very good on this. I think, thinking about this theologically, right, I begin with the proposition, right, that our bodies are good, right, but there are limits associated with our bodies, limits about where we can be, how we relate to time and place, the the frailty of the body, right? Which to some degree, I think that we are called to just not solve but bear. And I know that obviously requires a lot of further discussion to kind of elaborate and tease out. And these limits, I think we've framed them in the modern world as obstacles, right? That the happiness is always on the other side of more, right? And so to sort of call that into question, to refuse that framing of the good life, and rather to recognize that some limits are there because they are good for us, right? And that's one dimension, and that I think concerns information, right? We again, part of the mythos or ethos of Western society has been that knowledge is good, more of it is better, right? Unlimited knowledge is wonderful. And so I kind of get the idea, right? Censorship is bad. I can see the flip side of that, but unlimited knowledge all the time doesn't necessarily yield wisdom, right? T.S. Eliot has that wonderful kind of, and it's in a courses from the play The Rock, where where's the life we have lost in living? But he says, where's the knowledge we have lost in information, the wisdom we have lost in knowledge, right? So you have these different modes of knowing, and we're flooded with information. We're very short on wisdom. And in fact, the glut of information may actively hinder our capacity to act and think wisely. And I think, echoing Illich here, one thing that is becoming increasingly evident to me is that we have become the formation, our society's default formation is to form us as consumers, right? Who, when confronted with any problem or any unhappiness or any lack of comfort, our immediate instinct is to buy something, whether that's a thing, right, a possession, or a service, right, or an experience. And this is not just a kind of, I'm not just echoing the kinds of critiques of crass consumerism that have been around for a long time. I mean, that's certainly part of it, right? But even beyond that, right, that we have, what Illich would say is we have been de-skilled, right? I mean, and he takes aim at schools, at the medical profession, at transportation. All these cases, what's happened is that we have been given a service where before we were able to care for ourselves and for our communities. And so I think we're disempowered. We don't get the satisfaction, and I think the emotional stability and strength that comes from actively caring for ourselves and for our neighbor, right? And I think there's a way of maybe misreading, I would say, Illich in a very kind of crass libertarian way, but Illich's concern for autonomy and independence was always in the service of conviviality or interdependence, right? And so, we've been offered this unlimited dream of a consumer society where everything we would want is at the tip of our fingers, whether it's information or products on Amazon that can be delivered within 24 hours or less. And we've given up on community, I think, despite the fact that we're always saying we're hankering for it. But in practice, I think we usually choose against community. We opt for entertainment, and a lot of it is also, is an understandable product of precarious, economic conditions for large portions of our society. So there are a lot of factors, but I think we've fundamentally generated a world that's very good at meeting some material needs for some segment of the population, but very bad at meeting what we might think of as our immaterial needs, right? Or if we want to put that theologically, our spiritual needs, the needs of the soul, whether that's friendship, rootedness in place, and a capacity to use our own resources to shape the world around us. Illich has this great line where he says, you can either be rich in things or in the freedom to use them. And we've chosen to be rich in things, right? But we are de-skilled in countless ways that then leave us as nothing but consumers of entertainment and goods and services. So refusing that life, that vision of the good life, which entails accepting some measure of uncertainty and giving up what we think of as control, accepting a measure of risk, but then enjoying the fruits of that, I think would be my not so short answer to this question. And I think Ellul and Illich and Barry certainly are three people that are immensely helpful in helping us think about that.
Yes. Well, Michael, this is really good. It's a lot to process. So this will be something good I think for people to listen to, and don't speed the podcast up. Listen at the human scale, because this is it takes a while to think through some of these things, which is probably why many people don't want to, because we're moving so fast. As again, you mentioned Eliot Courses from The Rock. One of my favorite quotes from that is, he says, knowledge of speech, but not of silence, knowledge of words, lowercase w, and ignorance of the word, uppercase W. So, those are, it's a helpful conversation to have. So thank you for taking the time to meet with us today, and Lord bless you in your work.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Yeah, it was great to talk.